the main story that I want to tell is of this destruction, which you can see here in the slide on your left. The city of Sevastopol was destroyed 97% in the war by the Nazis and Romanians and some of their allies. And yet it's a story that's completely unknown. No one has written about, well, until now, urban reconstruction after World War II. And there are 1,500 different cities that were leveled during the war. And I thought as a young graduate student, well, why is it that we don't know about what is arguably one of the largest construction projects, the largest displacement of populations in Soviet history? So I took it on, a very naive graduate student, and said I'm going to tell the whole story. 1,500 cities became a little too daunting, and I finally settled on one. This is also a period that is very little known until this last decade or so. I was one of this young group of scholars going into the archives in the 90s as they're beginning to open up in the Soviet Union. And we began to get our first look at the post-war years, Stalin's last decade as it was. And a lot of the conclusions that I've got in my book and others have in their work are beginning to give us a picture now of what it was like under Stalin in those last decades. And it's quite different than you might anticipate. And I'll highlight that in a little bit later in the talk. So what was it that I was trying to do besides reveal a story that wasn't known and a period that really wasn't known? I simply want to know how this was accomplished, right? Such a gargantuan task of reconstruction, even in one city. If you can imagine a city at that point that was 110,000 people that only had 3,000 left after the war and virtually none of the buildings standing. I mean, they're standing like this, but obviously you can't inhabit them. How actually is that done? How is power manifested? Where is that power coming from? Who gets it done? Is it Stalin from on high, this kind of top-down model that has for so long dominated our field? Or was it history from the side, as my mentor called it, or history from below, that is regular people like us actually doing the work and coming up with the ideas? Why were certain choices made? Why is the city built in a very particular way? And what is the reasons, or what were the reasons for doing that? So those are the questions that I went into it with. And as all you students know, you start a research project and more questions pop up and you have to chase those too. But I want to just touch on three of the big ideas that I touch on in the book and some of my other publications. They are center-periphery relationships, so that is the relationship between Moscow and the officials in Sevastopol. What I call agitation and accommodation, which is the planning process, and I'll define those in just a little bit. And then the idea of localism. What does it mean to be local, and how does that work when you're talking about planning a city of over 100,000? Now, you have to understand that because this had never been looked at before, there is no secondary literature for me to work with. There is some printed literature, that is the old architectural journals and whatnot that I could use. But the vast majority of it was working in Moscow in dusty old tomes of poorly organized material. And then in the Sevastopol archive with fabulous archivists who basically brought me whatever I want that wasn't classified and giving me hints about stuff I hadn't even thought about asking for. And so as a number of scholars, including our own Wilson Bell, are beginning to learn is that when you get into provincial archives, everything looks different. So I started with 11 months in Moscow, thought I knew what I was talking about, then went to Sevastopol for 6 months and realized that I really didn't know anything at all. But one of the things that came from that is this idea of who's doing what and to whom. Our conception in Russian history is, at least for the Stalin period, is that Stalin says something, people rush around hoping not to get killed, and they do it. In fact, it was quite different during the planning of Sevastopol. When you replan a city, right, somebody says we need to replan it, they create a competition, different architects and planning agencies put up their models, and then it's decided who does what. Well, the first round of competition, all these Moscow-based architects built these grand facades, huge statues to Stalin, right? They're trying basically to save themselves and their careers. The local architects said, wait a minute, that's not what our city looks like, right? Our city is small, right? It's a low scale. It looks Greek because of the Greek origins. This is 2,500 years ago, this is the Greek city-state of Chersonesus, or Chersones. So they wanted something that looked like their city, and they started to push back against Moscow. So you have the monumentality of Moscow versus this kind of livable scale city that you'll see today. I mean, this is a little bit monumental, but that's also an imperial building that was just rebuilt. The Moscow architects didn't really understand that Sevastopol sits on a tectonic plate. So they wanted to build these massive skyscrapers before you had, steel reinforced concrete. And the locals said, well, wait a minute, if you build that, they will collapse. And so there's this local knowledge that helps to completely redesign the plans that Moscow had put together in the first place. And so this began to beg the question of which is more important, politics and ideology or metis, or that is local knowledge. And in the end, I conclude that it's a little bit of both, that the politics and ideology cannot be dismissed because at any point Stalin and his inner circle can say, right, you're going to do this and not that. But surprisingly, the central institutions in Moscow, as authoritarian as they were, and I don't want to minimize that, they actually listened to the local population. And not just the local chief architect or the city planner, but we have drawings in the local archive of people from the archaeological preserve, right, so the old Greek city-state saying, well, this is what it used to look like. This is what our new building should look like. This one absolutely fabulous letter to Comrade Stalin from this really unknown woman. She's just an average person in the city saying, wait a minute, you can't build a theater there on top of the hill. When it gets icy in the winter, we're going to have to climb up that hill and we're going to break our legs. Right? So, really common everyday people have the power to affect change. Obviously, this is not something we normally think about when we talk about the Soviet Union.